All right, welcome everybody. It's the Thursday edition of Talk Back. Good morning, John King.
Hey, good morning, Peter. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. We have a special guest waiting for us on the phone.
That's right. We have Senator Steve Daines joining us live from exotic Montana.
Hey, good morning.
Or is it tropical Montana these days?
You know, they set a record low high yesterday in Washington, D.C. It was 30 degrees for the high, and the all-time record low high was 32 going back to 1932. So you got to come back to Montana to warm up.
I guess so.
We're a city good at hitting low bars. I'm surprised that it took this long.
You're in the wrong zone. You should be in comedy, I think, there, John.
No kidding. So, Senator, I know that there are so many things going on. One of the things at the top of everyone's mind is this new American Health Care Act that has been proposed and set forward. So it's just drawing a lot of fire right now. So what is your thought on that?
Well, we're actively engaged in this most important piece of legislation. The bottom line is I want to see costs go down, premiums go down. As we've talked for years now regarding Obamacare, the result has been a disaster. And no matter who was elected president on November 8th, Obamacare is in a death spiral. It didn't matter if Hillary Clinton won or Donald Trump won. Obamacare is in a death spiral, and we need to be ensure that first of all, we create stability back in the insurance markets, because right now there's incredible instability. We also need to ensure we have stability as we deal with the states that expanded Medicaid. There were 31 of those states that did it, including Montana. The Montana Obamacare premiums, if you look back just in the last few years between 2013 and 2017, if you're a 27-year-old Montanan, you saw a 76% increase in your annual premiums. That's nearly $2,000 a year if you're 27. If you're a family of four, you saw a 122% increase in annual premiums over the last few years. That's an $11,000 a year increase in annual premiums. And as we all know in Montana, just this last year, these numbers got a lot of attention. Premiums increased 27 to 58% alone in our state. So as we go forward, we need to do a couple of things. Is one, we need to ensure that we restore stability back into the markets, because you're seeing insurance companies pulling out of markets all over the country. A couple of weeks ago, Humana was the last one to pull out. There's others that are saying they can't make it work. And that removes choice then from the American people. Choice provides competition. Competition drives costs down and creates better value and services in the free market. So what we are doing with this legislation, I think one of the guiding principles is restoring the primacy of the states in this equation, taking a lot of the mandates away, cutting the strings, and allowing the states to take the lead in this. So we've been actively engaged with our state legislators, with Matt Rosendale, our auditor, commissioner of insurance, because I firmly believe that if the states can bring these solutions forward, and we've been talking to the governors at length, they say, let us solve the problem. Anytime Washington, D.C. comes up with a solution, generally you should run for cover, because you know darn well that a plan that might work in New York or in California or Florida, you know what, it's not going to work in Miles City and Plevna and Eureka and Troy and Plains and Culbertson. And so I think this is I think the overarching principle as we're going forward here is federalism, returning the powers back to the states. Now, it's in the middle of the scrum. We've got the House, the Senate, the White House actively engaged on an hourly basis as we're putting forth changes, amendments that can deal with the Medicaid expansion transition, as well as, for me, very important, is to make sure the costs start going down.
One of the things that we have hopefully coming up next week is a chance to talk with Matt Rosendale about, I guess he's filled out a list of pieces of advice, I don't know exactly, that he sent to Washington, D.C. when it comes to health care. Maybe we'll get to chat with him about that and other local issues. I'm curious what your thoughts are. I've noticed in the Huffington Post and other outlets that you have expressed some concerns about the American Health Care Act. I was hoping you could kind of tell us What doesn't jive quite right with you? What sort of things are you looking at and are curious or concerned about?
What needs to be changed?
Sure. Well, first of all, back on Matt Rosendale's letter, I think his letter was spot on. We're aligned with the direction that Matt wants to go, and I think that aligns with where most Montanans want to go, and that is fundamentally Matt's saying, would you give us the chance to solve this problem? We can figure that out here in Montana. We really can. We had plans and systems in place dealing with pre-existing conditions and major medical years ago that worked quite fine in Montana. And when the federal government took it all over, what we just saw was spiraling increases in cost, and we can do much better, and we must. My critique, my concerns I shared this past week, look at the fact that premiums are planning to continue to go up, according to the CBO report. That concerned me greatly. It pointed out that they would start to come down after 2020, but I'm pressing the leadership, the chairman of the committees, to say, we got to do better than that. I want to see reductions in cost on premiums. We've been pushing hard on that for the last several years. The coverage issues have raised a lot of concerns, but some of these coverage issues, when you see folks, according to CBO, not having coverage, a significant part of that was because when you remove the mandates and, frankly, the coercion of the federal government forcing people to have to buy Obamacare, you're going to have folks who say, I just don't want to do it, and particularly when the prices are so high. So I think the solution longer term is definitely found in getting costs down and allowing states to put together insurance plans that really address the needs of folks who say, you know what, I don't need some big expensive health insurance plan at this stage in life. If you're a 27-year-old, you may say, I don't need to have all these other parts of this insurance plan. I just want to have basically catastrophic coverage or maybe a pharmacy benefit, just in the event that I have a car accident or some sickness that came along and be very expensive. That's protections they might want. They don't want to pay a lot for it, and that we can design plans that cost less, and that'll provide better access for thousands of Montanans.
So I think every American that buys health insurance wants it to be cheaper. I guess the question is how we get it there. I'm sure there's lots of proposals bandied about in D.C. right now. What are some of the ones that you think could lead us to lower prices when it comes to health insurance? Yeah,
well, it really, a couple things. You've got to remove what they call these essential benefits provisions of Obamacare. Obamacare basically says you must have this in your policy or it's not a legitimate health care plan. Well, I don't think that's right. Let the consumer decide what they want in or outside their plan. If you are a single person, let's say you're a single male, you don't want to necessarily have to have a pregnancy benefit in your health care plan. and so this is just some common sense in terms of allowing the consumer to be put in charge here of their selections. And what Obamacare does is it puts what they call these essential benefits, the provision there in the law. And that's part of the equation here of just providing more choices that really tailor a plan that better fits the needs of each individual, because health care is a very personal decision. Every one of us has different needs depending on our own health, depending on our age, depending on our family situation, and those are some of the freedoms that I believe will help drive costs down.
One of the things that I was actually right as you called in when someone heard that you were coming on, Ruth called in and said, would you please ask Mr. Daines, does he know if Donald Trump is coming to Montana to campaign since he took Zinke out of Congress and put him in his cabinet?
I think it'd be a great idea. We've expressed a desire to the White House. In fact, Mike Pence, we had lunch with him on Tuesday up on the Capitol Hill, and I was chatting with this team and said, I think it'd be nice if we get Vice President Pence in here in Montana and the President. So, as we know, that special election is going to come up very, very quickly. It's May 25th. And we're talking about such an important race for our state. Of course, we only have one member of Congress. Literally, as we speak, Montana does not have a voice represented on the floor of the United States House. When the Affordable Care Act repeal, Obamacare repeal, and replace going to go through the House, think about that. Montana will not have a vote in the United States House on that bill. You'll have votes in the Senate, not in the House. So this is such an important election, and we've made the request loud and clear to the White House.
Right. Now, So we're up against a break, so if you wouldn't mind, hang on for just a second. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. We'll be right back with Senator Steve Daines right after this. And we are back on Talkback. Senator Steve Daines joining us. Now, you said something about the Cottonwood Agreement?
Yeah. I thought it was the title of a Tom Clancy novel that wasn't finished or something, but apparently it's something that John Tester and Steve Daines are working together to try to combat or promote?
We are. Well, sometimes what are seemingly appear to be minor court decisions and perhaps a bit obscure can have dramatic effects on our state, and this is one of those decisions. The Cottonwood decision, the name refers to a Bozeman-based Cottonwood Environmental Law Center. It won a case before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals last year, and the ruling, what it does is it takes an issue with lynx protection, and the bottom line, it is devastating to all the forest plans on our ability to access our national forest in Montana for forest management, logging. It may be one of the most damaging rulings we've seen in a long time.
What does it require us to do? Scatter lynx treats or something in the forest before we go in there, or what?
No, well, it's not quite that simple. But what it does is it really relates to the Endangered Species Act and the Lynx. And what it does is all the forest plans that have been put in place over the years are now completely turned upside down, and they have to start again. And it just locks up everything right now in millions and millions and millions of acres of national forest. So there's a solution going forward. I mean, this one's so bad that we've got bipartisan support for it. I mean, that's a good thing. We have Republicans and Democrats joining us here in combating the overreach of extreme environmental groups. This is a positive sign. I'm very pleased John Tester's joining me, as well as Representative Mike Simpson of Idaho and Colin Peterson. Simpson's a Republican, Peterson a Democrat. And what this does is we can pass legislation that will actually remedy this legal decision from the Ninth Circuit.
What happens, though, Steve, if the lynx start eating the sage grouse? Then we're in really big trouble. So.
If we could teach those lynx to eat buffalo, we could solve a problem right now down in Yellowstone Park. But I think those cats just can't quite get there.
They can't jump that high.
The silver lining here is all the extra need for paperwork will drive up the paper costs.
Exactly.
The timber industry will...
Let's get Dave on the line. Wants to have a question for you. So, Dave, you're on with Senator Steve Daines. Go ahead. Oh, hold on. Stand by. Dave, you're on with Senator Daines. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious about Trump Care. Now, according to what I've read, older citizens' health care costs could go up significantly. Now, are you planning to vote for Trump Care, or what's your opinion on it?
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, well, as John and Peter pointed out, I've expressed concerns this past week about the outcomes. To me, we've got to stay focused on the impacts and the outcomes of legislation. So often in Washington, D.C., there's all the debates about policy, but where are we getting good information around what impact this will have? To the point that you brought up on increase in premiums for senior citizens, that is one of my primary concerns. I did not like seeing the fact that premiums are going to go up for the next few years before they finally start going down. We can do better than that, and we must do better than that.
We just had another caller, and she was curious and concerned about the issue of one of the things about the Affordable Care Act was that it had the 40-hour work week. If you worked a certain number of hours, you had to pay insurance for your employees. If you had a certain number of employees, there's a lot of machinations behind it. But do you know if they're doing anything to change that with the American Health Care Act?
Yeah, so these mandates, of which it's full of mandates, these are the mandates that we're going to repeal as part of the plan. Another interesting part of the legislation, and Dr. Tom Price, the Secretary of HHS, who I served with in the House, he's a great leader. We're glad to have him in that job. He's an orthopedic surgeon, by the way, leading the fight here for the Trump administration. Tom told us at lunch Tuesday that there are over 1,400 provisions in Obamacare, in that 2,700-page law. 1,400 times the phrase says, the Secretary shall or the Secretary may. In other words, it gives the Secretary of HHS a lot of latitude. And that's, frankly, I don't like that kind of legislation because it puts too much power in the administrative branch versus letting the Congress write the law. But the reality is because the law was so poorly written, it now gives Dr. Tom Price incredible abilities and powers to do a lot of changes administratively. And so as we look at the 1-2 punch here on getting out of this Obamacare hole, one is certainly going to be passing a repeal and replace bill in Congress. But the second, and should not be understated, is the ability for Dr. Tom Price, the new Secretary of HHS, to administratively undo a lot of the mess.
We are almost out of time with you, but I know you have a big vote coming up on Neil Gorsuch. Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I support Neil Gorsuch. He is a mainstream judge. He's not going to legislate from the bench. His education background's impeccable: Columbia undergrad, Harvard Law School, Oxford PhD. He is from the West. I think having a judge from Colorado, he'd be the first Western judge since Sandra Day O'Connor. He understands our way of life in the West. He's a sportsman. But I'll tell you what, he understands that he is under the law, and he is not there to make the law. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from Gorsuch, he said, and I quote him, "A judge who likes every outcome he reaches is very likely a bad judge, stretching for results he prefers rather than those the law demands." That's the kind of attitude and perspective you want to have from a Supreme Court judge. I met yesterday at the White House with a number of tribal leaders, including the CSKT here in Montana. Gorsuch has left a very strong 10-year record as a member of the 10th Circuit Court on Indian country and respecting sovereignty of tribes. And so I think you're going to see the tribes getting behind Neil Gorsuch. This is a solid conservative justice to replace Antonin Scalia. We're going to have a battle here in the Senate, certainly, of getting our friends across the aisle to join us in supporting Gorsuch. But I support him, look forward to voting for him.
All right. Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us today, Steve.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, enjoy the nice warm weather before you have to go back where it's cold.
I will. Right. Sounds good.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks
All right.
much.
Senator Steve Daines joining us there for a few minutes. We only had him for 20 minutes. So.
Well, we expect to have him on once a month coming forward.
Wow.
So, yeah, should be a great time.
It's awesome. All right. So we're going to take a little break. We'll have a little bit of open phones. And then I understand we have,
I believe, Mark Thane.
Mark Thane's going to be the superintendent. So we have the senator and the superintendent.
Unless he's still doing parent-teacher conferences. I don't know.
We're going to be right back. Stay with us. Yeah, only a few minutes left in this segment, so I thought since the big dance is coming up, Don Henley music there. All right, so the big dance, actually, you have to have your brackets in within like an hour.
Yeah, coming up quick.
Yeah.
I decided to fill out my first bracket ever.
Yes, and you did with your daughter. At the
tender age of 35. Yeah, my daughter and I worked last night. We came up with a system. We'll see how it works. First try on this.
Okay.
The nice thing about not caring.
You mean Naomi the shark?
Yeah. She was my. So I did this process. What I did is I went and got quote unquote professional sports analyzers.
Right.
Also known as just every other guy I know.
Sure.
And looked at their brackets, and then I would take whatever the majority pick from the pros was.
Right.
And I would lean that way. But because I don't really have a dog in any of these fights.
Right.
And none of them happen to be from Montana. I could care less. So, I just kind of lean with the majority opinion.
Yeah. Well, the really hard part is if you were going with the women's bracket, you'd have the only Montana team you can go to is MSU. And how could we do that here? I don't know.
I could. Well, my wife's partial MS. She's a Grizz cat, so
okay.
I can kind of support them.
Okay.
Almost as half-heartedly as I support all these other teams.
So who did you pick to win? Let's put it that way.
I went with Kansas.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. I went with Villanova.
Okay.
So
they have the little number 1 in the parentheses right after them. That's a good bet. By the way, the reason I care about all this is because my company, for some crazy reason, is giving away $1 million if we get a perfect bracket.
Do you know what the odds are against a perfect bracket?
I don't care. It's better than not trying.
It's right? Mark just said it's like a quintillion. It's like a quintillion to 1 because there are so many variables. I mean, you don't know which team is going to be the Cinderella. You just have no idea. Is it going to be Middle Tennessee State, or is it going to be St. Mary's, or is it going to be? I mean, who knows? Probably If you're thinking about Duke and thinking about Kansas, and thinking about Villanova and maybe North Carolina, those are the safe bets to probably reach the Final Four.
Yeah, so I've got Kansas versus Arizona for the final, with Kansas winning it, and hopefully the game doesn't go over 116 points total.
Well, you got to remember that Arizona has to get past North Dakota first.
They do that.
The entry from the Big Sky Conference.
On my bracket, they easily do that.
All right, we're out of time. We got to take another break for the top of the hour, and then the master of the Final Four, Mark Thane, is going to be joining us right after this. Hey, welcome back. It's hour number 2 of Talk Back. Of course, John King is right over there. I'm Peter Christian. John King, right over there. I'm Peter Christian. I just said that. Talk Back is brought to you by Bulls Eyewear. I'm so confused by my bracket. Bulls Eyewear, Selway Armory, Diggett Excavating, and First Montana Bank. All right, we are thrilled to have with us in the studio one of our favorite guests, Mark Thane, Superintendent of School District 1. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Always dressed nattily.
Just like the two of you.
The time you see either of us in a necktie is,
or a shirt that's less than 5 years old.
Yeah.
That'll be a day.
Or costs more than $6.95 at Walmart.
But I have to say, I'm very pleased. Mark Thane is apparently a connoisseur of the bracket arts.
Okay.
And we have plumbed the same dark depths, apparently, because we have the same final game.
But that doesn't translate into any success with marking a bracket.
Oh, shoot.
Well, anyway.
We'll see. This year, watch, you'll have an almost perfect bracket minus that last game. I just know it.
I'm
so overconfident this time. I'm just ready to get shot down.
I can't wait for this. We should have a poll to see who gets shot down first. That's probably
we should have a John Cries cam.
Let's see, the first game's at 10 o'clock, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Tip off at 10 a.m. and at 10:01, I'll be crying. But anyway. All right, so we could spend the hour talking about the Final Four, but we're not going to.
Well, that's roughly education-related.
Yeah, sort of, because they are schools, after all. It is the NCAA. So let's talk about how things are going. I know you're right smack dab in the middle of a whole bunch of construction projects and remodeling projects. And so what's going on?
An amazing amount of work is going on. It's been a while since we've spoken. We, over the winter break, completed moves into the new additions at both Rattlesnake and Paxson Elementaries. The new theater space, auditorium space at Seeley Swan High School is completed. We've done some minor renovations, some safety, security, some technology work at Chief Charlo that's also completed. Our major projects are Franklin and Lowell Elementary, which are both coming along at breakneck speed, and will occupy those spaces in August.
Now,
and the students will return to new buildings.
If we were to go over to where Franklin School is being built right now, what would it look like? What would we see?
It looks like a very imposing, large 2-story building. It's being built to a capacity of 450 students, which is a size that we determined all 9 of our elementaries should be, given our increasing enrollments and the way state accreditation standards play. It sits on a different portion of the property than it did previously. It's on the Johnson Street side. So it looks very different than it looked before, but it's really exciting. I know John would be interested to know that we interviewed the general contractors yesterday for the new Cold Spring School. And we'll be breaking ground early summer, doing our site work, and the target is to move into that new facility in August of 2018. So just a little more than a year from now.
We have already signed the easement papers, so you guys can develop a slide that goes from our house on the hill down to the school.
Is that parallel to the Chocolate River?
It's pretty close to. I think it goes. There's part of it that goes under the Chocolate River, but there's a sky dome, and then it shoots you back up.
And for the listeners out there, students went through a design workshop with the architects at Cold Springs, and they came up with some very unique ideas, such as chocolate rivers.
Yeah.
And
my son invented a classroom made of pillows. All the chairs were pillows. The floor was made of pillows.
There you go.
I asked him how they got electricity in there, and he didn't really figure that out.
Well, he's a young man accustomed to comfort.
Sure.
It's tough to learn when you're sitting in a hardback wooden chair.
You bet. So, again, I've touched on a number of those projects. We actually have architects working on an addition that will replace the modular buildings that are at Russell School, and we'll initiate that construction this summer. Washington Middle School will be the first of our middle schools to be built. And again, Washington has an annex that is separate from the rest of the building, and there will be a little bit of infill and connect that space. So we're really excited about that project. One of our most challenging projects is Hellgate High School. And Hellgate High School is about a $22 million project. And it sounds like a staggering figure, which it is. But it's a very old facility. And one of the significant changes is that we'll be converting from steam heat to hot water heat. So every space in the building needs to be replumbed. And, of course, new boilers, high-efficiency boilers will go in.
If you know anything about plumbers these days, I'm telling you what, that's a spendy issue right there.
None of it's cheap, actually. But of that $20 million, approximately $10 million is infrastructure, deferred maintenance, just taking the bones of an old building and rehabilitating it. So we have some exciting new additions, a new library that will be in the center of the building, and a rebuild of the kitchen facilities to serve the lunch program, et cetera, and then a number of educational spaces that will be improved. But when you look at the scope of that project, just simply the amount of infrastructure, electrical, mechanical, plumbing that needs to be addressed is amazing. So we have the contractor on board, and actually next week, spring break week, they'll move in and start some of their initial work.
Can I ask you, how many of the folks who are doing all this work, are they local folks?
The vast majority. So, again, I should go back and do a new calculation because we've hired a number of architects, engineering firms, and contractors since the last time I did a tally. But when I did a previous tally, 26 of the 31 professional service providers that we had retained were local. At this point, I think, I shouldn't say this out loud, but I think every general contractor that we've hired has a Missoula office.
But none of these are planners that worked on like Malfunction Junction or any of the other local achievements.
Those are likely civil engineers that do that kind of stuff. But we've been really fortunate. There's a lot happening in Missoula right now. The market's becoming somewhat saturated in terms of construction. So we have actually undertaken most of our projects in an alternative delivery model. So in a traditional model, you would have an architect design a facility, then you'd take the completed plans out and you'd bid and you'd accept the lowest bid and you'd build exactly what was designed. There's Montana code that allows you to use an alternative method, which is called a GCCM, General Contractor Construction Manager. And that contractor essentially assumes some risk if they go through an interview process and a request for qualifications to become the contractor on the project. So I'll use Cold Springs as an example. The design's not finished for Cold Springs yet, but yesterday we interviewed, and this afternoon we'll actually make an offer to a contracting firm to build Cold Springs School. And the reason we do that now is there's an opportunity while the school is still being designed to get the contractor and the architect together to say, okay, let's talk about constructability. If you design it this way, we can build it less expensively than if you design it this way. We can do value engineering, which essentially says, based on my construction experience, my understanding of the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all the infrastructure, the steel, whether we prefabricate off-site or whether we build all on-site, we can bring all that information from a contractor to bear on the ultimate price. So we'll negotiate with the contractors a contract that has a guaranteed maximum price. But instead of being competitive then at this point, they'll be part of the team that actually finishes the design elements so that we can get the best value for the dollars that we're committing to the project.
Because they want to make more based on what the right? They save money too.
We all save money. Yeah. And the budgets, quite honestly, are challenged. We did, on a square footage basis, really program these to be less expensive than much construction that's going on out there. So it's a challenge, and we've just found this to be a very successful process for us.
We're going to take a break. If you have a question for Mark Thane, he's the superintendent of School District 1. He'll be with us the whole hour. Lines are open. We have 4 lines open at 721-1290, and we will continue with Talkback right after this. Hey, thanks for joining us on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Now we have 3 lines open. Bill is waiting on line 1. John King over there, Superintendent of School District 1, Mr. Mark Thane, joining us in the studio this morning. And let's go right to the phone.
Yeah. All right, we got Bill in the queue here.
Do it. Let's. Bill, good morning. You're on with Mark Thane. Go ahead.
Good morning. Appreciate having you on this morning, Superintendent. I wanted to just ask the question. I read in the paper last week that the school system is looking at selling some of the pieces of property that it owns around the city that are no longer, I guess, considered for locations for the new schools. And I'm just wondering, what's the disposition of the funds that you'll receive from the sale of that land?
Excellent question, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
So what we're going to take a look at initially is some undeveloped sites that the school district owns, came into ownership through a variety of means over time. And if we've determined that those sites are not suitable for construction of a school, we felt it was incumbent upon us to evaluate whether or not this was an appropriate time to sell them. We, of course, in 2015 asked the community to support our bond measure to the tune of $158 million for school construction. As I referenced in my earlier comments, some of those projects are really tight budget-wise, and we also recognize that as we go out with a second issuance of those bonds, we only issued half of them initially, we're going to have to evaluate where all those budgets sit. So 3 parcels that I referenced in particular would be under consideration, one being a parcel that's adjacent to Maryland Park in Linda Vista. And before we considered a site for the new Cold Spring School, we evaluated that site as a potential location for the school. The accessibility, the slope, and the size of the parcel caused us to determine that it was not an appropriate site for a school. So the question is, do you hold on to that for the long term, or do you sell that, and then we can actually take that money, and we have a couple options with it. First of all, it cannot support our general fund. It would have to go into a building fund so that either, number one, we could offset some of the costs in our current bond projects and possibly in the second issuance of bonds reduce the burden.
I like number one.
The second thing we could do is, good point. The second thing we could do is keep it in the building fund so that we have access to revenue in the future if we do have facility needs that need to be attended to, and then we would not have to go back to the public and ask for a building reserve or an additional bond issue in order to take care of those things. So in many of our buildings, for example, we're replacing boilers and heat systems. But if in one of the buildings we had a boiler failure in a situation where we hadn't replaced a boiler, we would have access then to a revenue stream that could contemplate replacing that boiler. So again, the question is, it's a capital asset. If we choose to sell capital assets, we would dedicate them only to replacement of capital assets. So put it in a building fund. So in addition to Maryland Park, we have a piece of property. It's located across from Sentinel High School, and it's the piece of property where South Avenue now takes a jog in order to avoid Malfunction Junction. And so that road where it curves.
Which is really fun when it snows, by the way.
There you go. That cut a big parcel into 2 pieces, and we actually own those 2 pieces. Being the proximity to Sentinel High School, we can't conceive that we would ever build on that. So we might consider marketing that. Then finally, there's a parcel that's referred to by a number of names, Rymel Road, Heaven's Gate, 55th. It's located up basically where Shadows Keep is, except it's to the west, surrounded by largely ranch land, conservation easement, very top of the hill. It's not an area where we anticipate having enrollments of any significance.
Can I ask
open space?
How you obtained that particular property, because it seems so remote?
That one, I understand, was donated to the district a significant number of years ago.
I can't figure out what to do with this. You try.
Yeah. So that's a parcel, and again, we don't quite honestly know if that's marketable, and if there's not a reasonable return on a sale, we wouldn't move forward at this time. We would hold it until the future as an asset that could be sold at a later time.
What about some of the plots of land that are going to be not used as a school in the near future, i.e. Cold Springs, things like that? Are those going to go up on the market? Are they potentially for that? Or
we haven't actually had discussion about that. We do own some buildings that we're not currently using as school buildings. We have the former Emma Dickinson Elementary site, which we now use for our adult education program. We'll retain that. That's an area that we see potential for significant growth. Someday we may open that as a school again. We have Mount Jumbo School out in East Missoula, which for years we leased to Walla Walla College. We're using it right now as a swing space. The Lowell students are attending there this year while their facility's under construction. We've been approached by a community group that would like to lease it once Lowell moves out, so it generates some revenue for us. We own the Prescott School, which is currently leased by Missoula International School. We also own the old Whittier School, which is currently used by Head Start. So many of those are used for educational purposes, whether they're our district or other entities right now. And we haven't had any conversation about those specific properties. One thing that might be of interest, a number of years ago, the vocational technical programs in the state of Montana were part of the high school districts.
Right.
So the Missoula County High School District actually built the site that's currently used as Missoula College, and it was part of the high school district. In the early 80s, that transitioned to the Montana University System. And at that time, we sold that property and the two buildings to the university system for $10.
Wow.
Now that Missoula College is vacating that property will revert back to the school district.
You can buy it back for $20.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, so the Montana Board of Regents last Friday approved a resolution to have that property revert back to us at the end of June. So what will likely happen is we'll consider moving our fine arts program, our administration building, and our business building services into that facility, do some consolidation, and then we'll have the 6th Street administration building that will need to be considered for possible sale or for other future uses. So we'll look at all those properties. With regard to the Cold Spring site, I would suggest that at this point in time, we would likely hold on to a site just to see what happens demographically as the community continues to grow. None of the buildings at this point, other than the administration building, would we likely have conversations about potential sale.
Okay, we're going to come right back. Dave, if you'll hang on, we'll get you on just a minute. We come back from our break. We have 3 other lines open. Mark Thane, Superintendent of School District 1, joining us. We try to get him on once a month, but he's a very busy guy, so we're glad he's here. So if you have a question, give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. Talkback rolling right along. 721-1290 is our number. We have 3 lines open. Mark Thane joining us here in studio. Superintendent of School District 1. Dave has been waiting through the break. Dave, thank you for your patience, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Peter, remember you were supposed to ask Mr. Thane about curriculum, in particular civics, in particular the Electoral College. What kind of progress is being made in teaching students about the Electoral College? Because they don't seem to know a thing about it.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dave. So what do you think? Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I think that's not only students. I think there's a lot of confusion on the part of the general public with regard to the role of the Electoral College.
Sure, yeah.
Interestingly enough, and if we get an opportunity later, we'll talk a little bit about legislation that's pending, but there is a bill right now that would require a civics exam. Actually, right now it's been, I think, amended to be that it should be a civics exam should be requested to be completed by all high school students before they graduate. It's no longer listed as a requirement, but we do teach year worth of government in the high schools, and that is a requirement for graduation, and certainly the Electoral College is all part of that process. I think it's really interesting nationally, and this is not necessarily germane to your question, but the whole movement to have states determine that their electoral votes should be aligned with the national popular vote, which effectively, in my mind, wipes out the Electoral College.
It does. Exactly what
right now we have a number of votes equal to our representation in
There's a bill
Congress.
in the Montana legislature to do just that. I call it Give Montana's Vote to California Act.
Yeah, that's probably right. But the Electoral College certainly could be debated about its function at present. I know we've had a couple elections in the last few years where popular vote and the Electoral College has differed. And I do think that it's important that you have an opportunity to differentiate those two because I think, quite honestly, given our population, Montana would not play much of a role in a national election unless you do have those 3 electoral votes that are...
Not that we have an outsized role now.
Yeah, no. But I do think in a very close election, or one that's purported to be close, certainly 3 electoral votes could swing it one way or the other. So,
we've seen 2 of those in the last 8 years, and we still didn't matter.
Yeah, although at least these 2 elections, we did have candidates make appearances.
That's
in Montana,
right.
Which
That's right.
for many years we didn't see. So again, I think back to Dave's question, teaching government as a graduation requirement is important to us, and I do think civics education is important, not just in the high school level, but K-12. And I think current events allow great opportunity for that instruction in addition to what we see in our social science.
I have a great way to teach this. I've watched the drama of my daughter running for local office in a school, right? You have school presidents, representatives, things like this. And basically, the way you win the secret, if you're listening, kids, because I know today some kids are off early for spring break. I think my kids get out earlier today. Just promise everybody whatever you can't give them. That's right. Apparently the rule, because Naomi lost to a kid that promised no homework. Guess what? They're getting homework. So what you do is, instead of just having popular vote for president, you have an electoral college system for the kids.
Yeah, well, I would suggest that boy likely paid close attention to the national elections, because I see that same pattern being repeated over and over again.
Well, there's always a vote to ouster him. So let's get Dave on the line. Dave, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I just have one quick question for Mr. Thane. I used to work with a guy named Mike Thane up in the Plains area. You any relation?
He happens to be a cousin of mine.
Okay. Well, I was just kind of curious.
Yeah. Does that ruin it for you, Dave, or what?
Nope. My family is full of teachers. I have a daughter and a niece that's special ed teachers, and I have another niece that's a college professor, and so I'm kind of disappointed that some of these federal rules interfere with the teaching system, but that's what we got, and we got to live with it or vote in people that will be more supportive of the education system as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I appreciate your comment about her being a special education teacher. That's an area of significant concern for me right now, just in terms of our funding system. We just completed an analysis as we're working on our budget development, and we looked at our 10-year history of special education funding. And, again, it's critical that we serve students of all abilities.
Thanks, Dave.
And one of the things that we learned is over the last 10 years, the federal money that's come into our school district to support special education has decreased by 1%. There is one anomaly, and that was we had 1 year of ARA funds as part of the Reinvestment Act. So during that same period of time, 10 years, the state support has increased. But if you look at the total increase, only 24% of the increase in special ed costs were borne by the state. And essentially 75% of those increased costs were borne by the local taxpayers. So we've got all kinds of federal mandates with regard to special education. And again, it's critical service. It's important service. Students with all abilities bring a great diversity and just a wonderful background to our district. But we do have to provide a number of important support services to make sure those students can derive the maximum possible benefit from their educational program. And that's costly. And yet that cost is largely being borne by the local taxpayers as opposed to state or federal.
Okay, with that, we're going to take another break. We have a call coming in right now. We have 3 other lines open. I want to talk to you a little bit about Betsy DeVos and the impact, if any, so far, that has been felt. I know that there was all sorts of hue and cry. There was a big-time fight over the vote over her herself, and I want to find out if indeed the scaremongers are right that she's going to come in there and just tear the whole thing apart and just ruin everything for everybody. So at least that's what we've been told. So 721-1290 is our number. We'll be right back. All right, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. I'm Peter Christian. That's John King. Mark Thane, Superintendent of School District 1, joining us here in the studio. Now, I asked you a little bit about there's a newly crowned, if you will, head of the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos. Very controversial pick and a tough fight to get her confirmed. What have you noticed as a local school administrator coming down from on high in Washington from that office yet?
At this point in time, very little has changed, and I think time will certainly tell in that regard. We, again, in the last couple of years have been transitioning from No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, and the state of Montana actually submitted its required documentation to the U.S. Department of Education back in December in order to begin the compliance process with ESSA. One thing that we have seen is that there have been some transitions with ESSA that have compelled the state to have to come back and to redo portions of their plan and be resubmitted. So there are some changes coming. There's a little bit of uncertainty right now with Every Student Succeeds Act. So that's one. There are rumors, and this is not necessarily only Betsy DeVos, but I think it's the federal government in general, that there could be cuts ranging up to $6 billion from the federal Department of Education. And right now, much of that's awarded through block grant programs to the states, so that could change. And we'll just have to see what happens in that regard. And then, of course, there are the questions about school vouchers and charter schools. And quite honestly, the mechanisms would take a fair amount of time to work through. So I don't expect that we would see immediate change in that regard, but I think that's an initiative that could develop over time. So at this point in time, I would say nothing's dramatically different. We're concerned about revenue streams. We're concerned about the shifting playing field with regard to accountability measures. But I'm confident in most of those situations we'll take what's given to us and work with it and make the best of the situation.
All right, let's get to the phones. We have three folks want to visit with you. Sue, you're up first. Go ahead.
Hi, Mark. It's been a while since I've spoken with you, and since I don't have kids in school anymore, it's good to hear your voice.
Well, thank you for calling.
So I have a question. I was recently on the Town Hall with Senator Daines, and he was I never got to ask my question, but he was talking about the when he interviewed Betsy DeVos and what a lovely interview they had in his office and all this stuff. And one of the things he said that I thought was interesting, and I just wanted to find out if it's true, was that the state of Montana gets part of our funding is funded through the Department of Education, and we get 12% of our funding from the Department of Education. And I just wondered if that was true.
We do get some funding from the Department of Education. I can't tell you, quite honestly, whether it's 12% or not. As I referenced in an earlier comment, much of what's awarded to local districts is done through a state block grant program. So what happens is that money flows from the federal government to the state of Montana, and then it flows out through block grants. We have grants for neglected and delinquent youth, for example. We have block grants to serve students that are homeless or at risk of being homeless, the McKinney-Vento money. We have Title I money for students that come from families that live below the poverty line. So, and then again, we have some special education funding. So we have a variety of sources. It does come largely in block grants to us, and I can't quite honestly tell you what that percentage would be.
Well, that's really interesting because one of the things he said was, why don't we just get block grants to the states so that the states can do with that money what they will, and so they're already getting block grants.
They are some, and again, there are monies that flow in a variety of different ways.
Okay.
So
right now, it's a mix of different funding sources. Okay. Hey, question real quick from our caller, Nick. Nick wants to know, he says he's heard that they're removing valedictorians from the school system here in Missoula. He was wondering, tongue-in-cheek, if we're going to stop accepting championship trophies as well, and hoping you could go into the whole valedictorian decision.
Sure, and actually that was a decision that was made actually a number of years ago, and when we have decisions that come down and will impact students' graduation or graduation requirements, for example, the understanding is that they will take effect with the first group of students to enter high school after the change is made. So essentially it's a 5-year phase-in. So what I'd reference, for example, is that Big Sky High School for years has not had valedictorians. They've had the Eagle Medallion that they presented. And it's determined based on scholastics, based on community service, based on a variety of such
And these
things.
are the things that colleges look for, right?
Right. So, and I could get into a personal story about that, which maybe I'll share in just a minute. The issue that we saw when the district began looking at valedictorians is there were students who were electing not to opt into the most rigorous courses in some situations because they wanted to preserve their grade point average. And that was counter to what we wanted to see students do as a school district. Now, when we were off the air, John referenced, well, you could weight the grades, and we did actually take a look at grade weighting. Most universities unweight grades then when they take transcripts before they do admissions decisions. So that's one thing. And then the question is, do you factor in only on a certain number of AP classes? how do you deal with concurrent enrollment classes at the university system and the amount of rigor there versus traditional courses. So essentially, the decision was made that we would move away from valedictorians and we would work toward something similar to what the Eagle Medallion represents, which is the whole student.
So when my daughter graduates with her Eagle Medallion, or whatever it happens to be, and heads out to Kansas, the NCAA bracket-winning university,
right?
Sure.
To play basketball,
right. And she tells, and she puts on her college transcript, I won the Eagle Medallion. I mean, is anyone going to know what that even means? I mean, how does that help her in her life?
No, and quite honestly, those things in my mind shouldn't be on the transcripts to begin with. So,
but if someone knows I'm a valedictorian, they know that in competition with my peers, I was a step above.
Possibly. So let me talk for just a minute about that. So I have a daughter who actually just graduated from college last May.
Can you hang on with that? Because
you bet.
We're like 2 minutes past the break. I'm so sorry to do that. We also have Jeannie, Anna, and Eric. We're going to try to get everybody on, and we'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Talkback, 721-1290. That's our number. That's John King over there joining us in studio. Mark Thane, Superintendent of School District 1, who was right in the middle of a great story when Mr. Pushy Peter interrupted. So go ahead.
Well, I know that we have callers waiting, so I'll be brief. But when we talk about valedictorians and talk about college application, one of the things that was very instructive for me was, as a parent 5 years ago, I went with my daughter to a visitation at a school. She wanted to go to nursing school, and we looked at 3 different programs. And we were in this large meeting hall, and a parent raised a hand to ask a question of the admissions folks that were in attendance. And the question was, what's more important, my GPA or my ACT or SAT score? And the response from that university was actually neither. What we do when we evaluate students for admission is we want to see that they access the most rigorous course offerings that are available in their high school. And they want to see a well-rounded student. And they said, GPA and your scores probably fall about 3rd or 4th on the list for admissions decisions.
Which is great argument for weighting those kind of classes for the valedictorian position. If you give more weight to advanced level courses, more kids will be forced to take those courses if they want to be top of their class. And I can tell you, as a guy that was one of those kind of guys, I get rubbed dirt in my eye that I wasn't valedictorian in my class, but my wife was in her class.
Ooh.
And we were in the same class, but in different fields in university, okay. Right? And so I'm just your salutatorian scum around the house.
There you go. And I'm sure that's irreparably harmed you all these years.
I can certainly see poor John. He weeps in the corner every day. Let's get Jeannie on the line. Jeannie, thanks for holding. You're on with Mark Thane. Go ahead.
Good morning, Jeannie.
Hi. With all due respect, I think there is groupthink going on in the Missoula School District. Actually, I've experienced it. The issue of groupthink of school officials that was exacerbated in 2004 with the ousting of some neighborhood school advocates on the school board is that larger schools are better than smaller schools, which goes against current studies. And I had just one comment, and then I have 2 questions. So in 2004, some trustees even called schools, quote, attendance centers. So I have 2 questions relating to this. One question, therefore, is, do you see a reversal of this groupthink in MCPS and a trend to neighborhood schools using schools already in the neighborhoods in the near future? And number 2, do you see any movement to reverse the 2004 school closures so that 6th through 8th grade children on the north side can actually attend a school without being bused to larger schools on the south side? And I'll stay on and listen.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Jeannie. So first of all, as we began our bond projects, we actually did a study to try and determine what we thought was the optimal size for a school. And we did some research nationally. There are schools of varying sizes all across the country. And one of the things that is important to consider is there's a certain economy of scale that comes with certain sizes and configurations. So we obviously need to provide the best instructional program possible for the students, and I know that that's a value that you hold, Jeannie. And I also know that we have a responsibility to the taxpayers to be as efficient as possible. So given the way state law works and the accreditation standards, we did the work and determined that schools of 450 to 500 students would be the size that we would seek in the Missoula community. That is larger than some of the neighborhood schools that we've historically supported. But if you have those smaller neighborhood schools and you still have the overhead associated with utilities, with administrative staff, with custodial staff, secretarial staff, etc., the cost to operate those facilities on a per-pupil basis is greater than some of the larger schools. So, again, there's that economy of scale that comes into play. We do have 9 operating elementary schools in Missoula, and largely they are
I'm going to let you go, Judy, because we have lots of other callers. But go ahead and finish.
No, so they are largely neighborhood schools. And I know Jeannie feels strongly about the Prescott School in the Lower Rattlesnake, and I certainly understand that. But Prescott School is a very small school. Would, again, I believe if we were to look back at the decision that was made to close Prescott School, it was based on that economy as much as anything else. It wasn't large enough to sustain at the same cost per pupil the kinds of services that students in other schools across the community were receiving.
Okay, and with that, we're going to take a 1-minute break, and then we have Anna and Eric, and we have 2 lines open at 721-1290. So if you want to get a comment or a question to Mark, you have about 8 minutes. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Want to get as many calls in as we can with Mark Thane. Go ahead, John.
Just real quick on the medallions, because I'm totally interested. I just want to know, like, are there different types? I mean, is there just like a medallion, or do you get a medallion for science and literature or different stuff? Or?
No, again, the intent is to look at overall. Now, there are certainly scholarship opportunities that come up that are discipline specific, et cetera. But the concept of the medallion is to recognize students for the whole body of work. Academic, community service.
And you say students, so there's more than one medallion recipient?
Yes. So typically, I would expect 10, 12, 14 kids might be recognized. And quite honestly, with valedictorian, we had a situation in one of our high schools a few years ago where we had 14 students that graduated with 4.0. So there were 14 valedictorians in a single high school.
Everybody gets to speak at graduation.
There you go.
All right, let's continue on. Anna, you're on with Mark Thane. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Yes, I would like your opinion on something. I am a trustee in my school district, in my district. And the last meeting I went to, they talked about House Bill 307. And I'm sure you're aware of what that is. It's infrastructure, things like that. And it seems to me that instead of the state legislature putting more money into public education, they've left it up to the school boards now to do that, so we take the fall for taxes going up. Can I get your opinion on that?
I think your observation is a good one. I think the cost of doing business for school districts has largely transitioned from state to the local taxpayer. And you reference Senate Bill 307, which is a bill by Lou Jones, and essentially it is to deal with some of the infrastructure needs that might have otherwise been dealt with through a building reserve request. And we know that statewide we have infrastructure problems with schools, roads, bridges, lots of systems. But there are many school districts, because of the tax burden, that have not been successful in passing bond issues or mill levies. And yet those critical needs continue to accumulate. So the legislature's created a vehicle, or will, if Senate Bill 307 passes, to levy the local taxpayers to take care of those deferred maintenance needs and facility needs. However, as you referenced, right now it's being borne on the back of the local taxpayer as opposed to statewide tax support. And I do think that is an issue that will, as an education community as well as a community at large, need to continue to address, and that is the shifting responsibilities. So what we're seeing at the legislature, again, is that they're proposing significant cuts in state funding for education. The bottom line is that's going to shift that responsibility to the local taxpayers. If we intend to continue to staff at the same levels with appropriate class sizes and to operate with the same programs, the only recourse we have then is to ask the local taxpayers to support those programs. So here in Missoula County Public Schools, we'll actually be discussing later this month the possibility of running an operating levy, a mill levy. And mill levies are different than building reserves and bonds. Mill levies function to serve the general fund budget, which is teacher salaries, curriculum materials, staff salaries, those kinds of things. And we're at a point right now where our budget, given state support, would not support us retaining the number of staff members nor the number of programs that we have.
When we look at the pie chart of how we're paying for our schooling here in Missoula, what is the slice that the state pays for versus the local?
I wish I had that with me. I could get that information for you because we have looked at it, but I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Is it a big piece?
There is a fair amount that comes from the state because there is a guaranteed tax base provision and there are some specific state funds that flow to us. But right now, the shifting burden to the local taxpayer, I think, is a real concern. No, I recognize that bottom line is it's all going to come from the taxpayers in one way, shape, or form. So whether it comes from the state or the local is somewhat irrelevant. The real concern I have, though, is that what we do when we shift it to the local taxpayer is we put a disproportionate burden on some communities than we do on others. And
all right.
That's troubling.
Let's try to get at least one more call in. And this is Eric. Eric, we have about 2.5 minutes. Go.
Good morning, Eric.
Eric, hi. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mark. I was interested in your discussion about the civics exam and the electoral college. And hopefully a civics exam would teach more than that. But I was wondering if you guys would be ready for the backlash from the students when they find out the disparity between our government and how it's supposed to run and what the state and the federal government are doing, or as far as what our public servants are doing, like the funds coming from the federal government to the public schools. The federal government has no authority to give money to public schools in Montana, nor does the state have the authority to receive it. Anyway, another thing is the drug dogs coming through the schools and the violation of their rights there. Anyway, are you willing to deal with the backlash?
Well, thank you. First of all,
thanks, sir.
Just a couple quick responses. Number one, with regard to civics education, I would hope that one of the outcomes would be that students would come to understand the system and then might become motivated to work to affect change if they feel that change is necessary. So, I wouldn't want us to perpetuate an ignorant populace out there. And so the more information they have and the more educated they can be with regard to the issues, I think the greater likelihood there is for them to affect positive change. You referenced drug dogs, and I might just mention we do not use drug dogs in our district, and that's because of some decisions that have come down court-wise. It does create some issues with regard to whether or not there's reasonable cause to do such a search.
Well, what about, in the 1 minute we have left, what about discipline for a student that is found having an illegal substance in his or her possession? What happens?
We definitely take that very seriously, and there's a hierarchy of discipline, and that's one of the things that would be considered very serious. And ultimately, there would be a complete and thorough investigation, and then there would likely be consequences that could range from anything suspension up to expulsion, particularly if a student's trafficking. So that's something we take very seriously. The difference with drug dogs is that when you catch a student who's actually in possession or using or under the influence, it's specific to that student. It's not us going in and making assumptions about the entire student body.
We're almost out of time. Real quick.
I just wanted to give him a talkback medal for coming on the air today.
There you go.
Great. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Mark, it was always a pleasure. We look forward to your next visit.
Thank you much.
You guys have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow morning on